So, in a way, this is connected to Diego, but if Tolkien writes fantasy, Dunsany, who influenced Tolkien, is doing something different. So, not long ago, I heard a fellow scholar remark that every single paper about Lord Dunsany begins with a lament about the neglect of this writer, and my own thesis is guilty of this. But the truth is that in most cases, his name is barely recognized. So I must begin with this reminder. So Dunsany is an Anglo-Irish writer. He was born in London in 1878, and he became the 18th Baron of Dunsany in County Meath, one of the oldest baronies in Ireland. And he died in Dublin in 1957. So there is a general agreement regarding the limited critical reception of Dunsany's work. First, that he is a writer of fantasy, a writer of worlds where, and I quote, reality is delightfully banished. But that this was followed by a rejection of this fantasy phase after the Great War, and especially after the Irish Free State was established. However, some scholars have other ideas concerning this apparent rejection of fantasy. That is, fantasy understood as a story world whose rules do not apply to our world and are coherent with its own ontology. Now, Patrick Moon believes that Dunsany's complex fantasy points to a type of literature in line with modern or even postmodern aesthetics, but this has not been explored in depth until now. So the purpose of this paper is a reappraisal of Dunsany's early works to identify those elements that break the internal coherence of the text, the plausibility of the story world as a self-contained realm, and instead see his work as interrogating the notions of the real and the structures that underpin the text as text. This means that even his early works align not with fantasy, but with another concept, and that is the fantastic. Now, the fantastic was initially and controversially theorized by Todorov, Caldois, Louis Dewas, and Todorov based his definition on a moment of hesitation, right? Experienced by the reader and sometimes by the character between a natural and a supernatural explanation. Now, according to this definition, moving beyond this moment of doubt means departing from the realm of the fantastic into the realm of the uncanny or the marvelous. This definition has indeed been suggested in connection to Dunsany's work, but in passing, due to the limitation of the theory being applicable only to a limited number of works. So scholars such as Gallagher have determined that Dunsany's work, where the impossible phenomena often seems authenticated, that is, confirmed, cannot be analyzed through the lens of the fantastic. Revisions of the theory of the fantastic, however, suggest a more comprehensive reassessment of the term that is broad enough to accommodate non-binary representations of reality. Barrenechea redefines the term fantastic to include all literature that implicitly or explicitly presents abnormal, unnatural, or unreal elements in the form of a problem, compelling the reader to reconsider reality itself. Now, David Roas suggests that these works postulate, and I quote, the possible abnormality of reality. Additionally, Nancy Trail suggests that in some fantastic works, the domain of the possible may barely be detectable in the text, or is just a framing device. Now, these devices question the internal coherence of the text as fantasy, and thereby transgress the concept of reality at both the diegetic, that is the story level, and reading levels, qualifying them as fantastic. So, bearing this in mind, let's take a look at Dunsany's first work. Now, in The Gods of Pegana, published in 1905, he develops a new pantheon of gods. And despite initially appearing as a self-contained cosmogony, such as like the Silmarillion, for example, the work reflects on the mechanisms that sustain the gods themselves and their creations, which are the same mechanisms to which the reader's reality is subject, revealing itself as possibly an illusion. The world of Pegana itself is shaped by the dreams of a great sleeping god, Mana Yud Sushai. Mana dreams all that transpires, which in turn spawns further dreams among the gods. The narrator includes reference to Greek mythology or Allah, thereby grounding the comparative framework with the world of the reader. That is, what we consider the real world to be. Pegana seems to exist in the same historical chronology as Earth, in an undefined past. This is kind of similar to Tolkien's Middle-earth. This text, however, locates the reader as part of a book that an indeterminate entity called Trogol is written and contains the cosmogony, suggesting that the cosmogony will cease to exist when there are no more pages to turn. The difference between Tolkien's Middle-earth and Pegana lies in the ontological instability of the latter, where the impossible is not fully disauthenticated, but instead draws the attention of the reader to the concept of the real as a construct, exposing the artifice behind the story world itself. This is articulated through the character Jadin, who implores that the pages of this book, and this is a quote, not be turned, for to turn the pages of the book we are reading would mean the end of his life. The gods themselves are subject to what is called in the book a scheme of things, and a similar occurrence is found in the sequel to the Gods of Pegana, Time and the Gods, where time itself destroys the creation of the gods, who are, in turn, dreamt by the narrator. The construction of Pegana is discussed in artistic terms. We are told that Mana's dreams, which sustain the ontology of Pegana itself, are fueled by music, and I quote, troubled by the sound of song. Additionally, even the gods appear to be characters in the book of Trogol, and this higher narrative or cosmic and graspable level problematizes their ontology, prompting reflection in the reader. Similarly, the narrative voice constantly highlights the creative power of language, imploring the reader, and I quote, to believe, because, and this is a quote, it has been written. In this case, but not keeping the generic verisimilitude of the text as a mythopoeia, questioning the tenets of intra and extra-diegetic reality, what Linda Hutcheon calls the coherent heterocosm created by the fictive reference of the signs, is disrupted, as the reader is forced to gauge the ontology of this reference. The Gods of Pegana compels one to measure the causality of the text's impossible elements. So, for example, Monk, Dunsanys, god of death, reminds us, addressing a human in the text, of the power to choose some other way, to escape death, reminding us that if the scheme of things were to change, so would the narrative. The key is that the impossible realm of Pegana is questioned but not disauthenticated. The unease produced by a scheme of things that we cannot comprehend is kept in the text. And as Barrenechea highlights, and I quote, the silent threat of the other, or the suspicion that perhaps in this world of men there is no order at all, is a defining element of the fantastic. Now, these ontological absences recur in Dunsanys' work, but more often than not, they are embedded in the very language surrounding the manifestation of the impossible. Patricia Garcia, in her theory of the fantastic, refers to these occurrences as threshold sentences, which she identifies as characteristic of the evolution of the fantastic towards postmodernity. In these sentences, the transition between the domains of the possible and the impossible traditionally achieved by crossing a threshold or opening a magic wardrobe, such as what we can see in Narnia, occurs through linguistic mechanisms, obfuscating the reference and preventing the reader from pinning down the ontological plane in which the sentence operates. Dunsanys uses this device to articulate the anxiety of modernity, where the closest thing to a familiar referent, which he finds in nature, is overtaken by a world that, in his words, is 2 degrees removed from reality. So an example of this can be seen in A Narrowscape, published in 1916. In this short story, a supposed magician living in a cave next to the London Tube decides that, and I quote, London had lived long enough, had abused its opportunities, had gone too far, in short, with civilization, and decides to, and this is a quote as well, to wreck it. The magician casts his spells, heralding the end of the city, but nothing seems to happen. So the story ends with the magician blaming his acolyte for not delivering the correct ingredient for the spell. So he articulates his complaint, and I quote, as he sunk into the earth. In this moment, the reader cannot determine from which domain the voice of the magician comes, leaving the possibility of a future destruction and reset of London open. Therefore, even in these early works, the manifestation of the impossible has an ontological focus that consistently challenges the notion of the real, demonstrating a degree of narrative self-consciousness. This interrogation allows Dunsanys to use the fantastic as a vehicle to address very contemporary issues, predicting an era of post-truth. In his words, it could lead us to self-destruction, or to a world where even the food we assume to be real, like the cheese in his play Cheezo, might in fact be soap made from sick animals, and this actually happens in the play. Analyzing Dunsanys through the lens of the fantastic allows us to contextualize his work not as an isolated phenomenon, an oasis as it has been termed, but within the corpus of Irish writing, especially within the different strands of Irish modernism. The fantastic emerges in Irish writing, from Yeats' The Hare and His Egg to the self-conscious ontological superpositions of Beckett's Molloy, the phantasmagorias of James Joyce Ulysses, or the ontological disorientations of Flann O'Brien. These authors were preceded by Le Fanu or Charles Maturin, who wrote a kind of fantastic that was experimental, but still aligned with English Gothic fiction in terms of its epistemological focus. These two are closer to Todorov's definition of the fantastic. Modernity, however, would give way to a type of work with an ontological focus, departing from a notion of reality itself as unstable and making it the focus of the work. Now, Brian McHale, in his theories on postmodernity, refers to the fantastic with a question. The fantastic, a genre of ontological poetics, and a witch from Dunsanys' invented world of Jan asks the question, and do you know that life is an illusion? And startles the protagonist by reversing real and impossible reference. She states, you are not the only one who can imagine London. It is this ontological instability that positions Dunsanys' work as a compelling case for my suggested revision of his work, not as a writer of fantasy, but as a writer of the fantastic. Now, I think I have a bit of time left, do I? Yeah, okay. So I'd like to read another quote that captures what I've been talking about, and I think it's a perfect example of Dunsanys' sense of the impossible. Now, Tir na Nog, which from its place outside geography exerts through the twilight that curious lure to which morning hath wholly surrendered. It is strange indeed that talking of Tir na Nog seemed to strengthen its frontiers, and sentence by sentence, as though they were the steps of a traveller walking westward through twilight, Tir na Nog came nearer. over the shrubs and through the branches of evergreens, now blackening with the approach of night that seemed to come first to them, we both glanced westwards to where the day was sinking. On what shores, we wondered. Now this quote comes from Dunsanys' descriptions of Tir na Nog, the Celtic otherworld, in his novel The Curse of the Wise Woman. Here, the impossible domain is part of the sentence itself, but both domains, the possible and the impossible, coexist but do not cancel each other. It captures Dunsanys' aesthetics, which postulate the need to explore a sense of the real, even within the fantastic impossibilities that literature allows, posing the emphasis on the question, what is reality, rather than just offering an alternative to it. Now, I hope I managed to kind of compress all the theory in this brief presentation, and I'll be happy to answer any questions at the end.
Thank you very much, Maria, for a quite fantastic talk. And now, we're on to our final presentation in this panel by Cristina. She opens it up. I'll be reading her bio note. María Cristina Guerrero García is an assistant lecturer in the Universidad Politécnica de Madrid, a Master of Philology in Irish and Celtic Studies by the Queen's University of Belfast, 2002, and Master in Teaching English as a Second Language through Literature by the University of Alcalá, 2008. She obtained her PhD by the National University of Distance Education, UNED, in 2020. Her thesis, Quite Another Thing, Irlanda en la obra completa de Oscar Wilde, was awarded the third prize for philological research, Professor José Romera Castillo, in 2022, and published by Verbum. Since then, she has been researching about the Irish author independently. And today she's here with us to present her talk, The Wanderings of Dorian, Traces of the Myth of Oisin in Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray. So, Christina, whenever you're ready, go ahead.